Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you. We've got special guest Doug Wilson, author of American Milk and Honey and many other books, very influential, very well read. So I'm really thankful to have Doug on the show. We're going to talk about his book. Doug, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to get you on. We actually recorded this a few months ago, but there were some technical problems. So we're going to try to redo that interview to the best of our abilities.
I always assume when things like that happen that God is being kind to me, and then I said something stupid.
Sure, that's one way to do it.
It's a do-over.
It's a do-over. Well, that happened with me in my interview with Andrew Sandlin, and Andrew Sandlin was talking about the pride agenda, the LGBTQ, all this, and then his power went out in his home. So I don't know if that was demons in that case,
right,
or if it was God preventing him. We attribute it to demonic influences.
But
either way, we're glad to have you back on. So this book, first of all, I wanted to ask, this is something that came out in the last year or two. What was kind of the reason in your mind? I mean, you write, obviously you're a prolific writer, you write a lot. What, in your mind, why was this an important book to publish at this time?
It was one of those things where I would sort of assume a higher power at work, because I was noticing as a pastor some troubling things in conservative, reformed, evangelical circles, comments here and there and whatever. And over the years, I've written on things Israel and things Jewish and on anti-Semitism from time to time as particular, if there's a war in Israel or something, or terrorism events, I've written on it before. And I was noticing an uptick in some of these problems. So I began writing, and I thought I need to assemble what I've written before and edit it and put it all together and sort of have a comprehensive take on it. And so I did that. And then right after the book came out, or right around the same time, there was sort of an explosion of comments, discussions, overt anti-Semitism on the border. Maybe was that anti-Semitic or not? What's the problem with Christians saying that Jews need to be Christians? Is that anti-Semitic?
Right.
No, and I would say no. But there are multiple competing or conflicting definitions of anti-Semitism. So the Anti-Defamation League would define anti-Semitism differently than I would, and they would define my position as anti-Semitic.
Right.
But there really is such a thing as anti-Semitism, and I thought we needed to go back to the scriptures and sort it out. What does the Bible actually teach about the relationship of Christians to Jews? And that entails a bunch of other things, like, are there really even any Jews anymore? Like,
right, yeah.
Are the Ashkenazi Jews actually Jews? Are the promises of Israel, are the promises to Israel defunct? Are they fulfilled in the church? All of those things need to be sorted out. And so that's what I attempted to do in this book.
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate you doing that. It seems like an issue that's been brought up, especially since Elon took over Twitter, or X now. And it's been an accusation from the world. And then, you see a lot of people asking questions. And then you've got the war in the Middle East between in Gaza and Israel and all that kind of stuff, right, and the attacks on Israel. And so it is a question. And growing up in more of a dispensational kind of left behind culture, I'm having to reframe the house, so to speak. And so I think there's some basic questions I want to get through that for Christians that just kind of you address in the book.
Right.
That we need to get clarity on. One is that for a lot of people, they've grown up in either a church or just Christian culture where they think that Judaism is somehow a parallel track of redemption, that there's somehow redemption or there's special, a special dispensation for them. So why is that not the case? Because that actually would be surprising to some American Christians to hear that they don't have a special path of redemption. Why is that not true?
It's not true, because there's one name given under heaven by which we must be saved. That's the name of the Lord Jesus. And if I'm talking to Jewish friends, there is going to be, and I have them, there is an insuperable barrier between us in my conviction that Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus rose from the dead, then the Jews have a responsibility to acknowledge him as their Messiah. If he didn't rise from the dead, then I have a responsibility to admit that we, of all men, are most to be pitied, as the Apostle Paul put it. So whether or not Jesus rose from the dead is not a trifle. It's sort of it's the watershed of all of these issues. There's one way of salvation, always one way of salvation. That is to respond to God's word, God's gospel, by faith. And so consequently, while I believe that the Jews still have a place in God's prophetic program, they don't have that place because there's another way of salvation. There is only one way of salvation. It's Christ alone, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, faith in him as the resurrected Lord. So all conservative Christians have to confess that the name Christ is simply the Greek word for Messiah. That's a claim about the Old Testament, and you can't really smudge the difference between Judaism and Christianity on that point. It's not a smudgeable difference. That said, so this is probably a good place to bring up terms I define in the book, and that is supersessionism is the view that all of God's promises in the Old Testament find their fulfillment in the Christian church. That's the supersessionist view. And then in the book, I define the difference between hard supersessionism and soft supersessionism. Hard supersessionism says all God's promises are fulfilled in the church, and today's Jews have nothing whatever to do with the Bible at all. There are no unfulfilled prophecies concerning them. They are in the same covenantal position as the Hittites or any other ethnic group. The gospel is for them. The gospel should be preached to them, but they have no unique place in God's eschatological purposes or plans. That's hard supersessionism. Soft supersessionism says that the church is Israel now, the church is the heir of all God's promises, and that the Jews, unbelieving Jews, were cut out of the olive tree and are no longer in the olive tree. So it's because they're no longer in the olive tree in Romans 11, that's a supersessionist position. The hard supersessionists say there's no promise that they're going to be grafted back in again, and the soft supersession position says, yes, they will be grafted back in again. And when they're grafted back in again, that will be the kickoff to a great period of blessing for the rest of the world. So I'm a soft supersessionist.
Right. Okay. So kind of two corollary questions on that. First would be, as far as the representation throughout church history from the reformers up till now, I know that's a wide array of people, but just from your own reading, are both of these views found more predominantly in Christian history than, let's say, the dispensational view, where there is a different parallel track? Like, is a hard supersessionist view compatible with, let's say, Westminster Confession and other Christian thinkers before our time?
Yeah. So in the Reformation, basically, I would say there are three positions. One would be the soft supersession position, which is by and large the historic position of the church, particularly the Reformed Church. The Westminster Confession refers in the Westminster Standards refer to public prayers needing to involve conversion of the Jews, which is a hat tip to Romans 11. That's the soft supersessionist position. The hard supersessionist position is relatively recent in Reformed circles, where Romans 11 is taken in a preterist way, where the promises or the outline that Paul gives there was fulfilled in the first century. So that's the hard supersessionist position. Then the dispensational position is unique in church history. The idea that there's a parallel track, two ways of salvation, God has two peoples, the Christians and the Jews, is, in my mind, theologically incoherent. And the one advantage it has North American evangelicals have been very friendly toward Israel and all things Jewish, which I take as a positive thing. But I think that the foundation for that friendliness is shaky, um, because the dispensationalists say the Jews are God's special anointed people, and we must protect them until the Antichrist destroys them. And you say, oh,
Right. So with the the second question I was going to ask was, for a lot of Christians they get really confused on, okay, yeah, agreed. What do we make of Abraham, Moses, David, these figures in the Old Testament? Do we call them Christians? What do we, Christ had not come yet. How do we make sense of their salvation? And so that becomes because the dispensational view resolves that tension. And if you take that away, if you say reject that, okay, what do we do with that? How would you answer that for people?
So to say that Moses was a Christian is syntactically odd, but not wrong. Okay, and here's why I would say that. Paul says in, I think it's Galatians, that God preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham. So Abraham believed the gospel. In your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham responds to the gospel. Jesus says that Abraham looked forward and sought to see his day, the Lord's day. He saw it and was glad. So Abraham looked forward to Christ. Paul says in Corinthians that the people in the wilderness drank from the rock that was Christ. Right, the rock accompanied them. They in Hebrews it says that Moses spurned the treasures of Egypt in order to follow Christ. So I think it's far simpler to say Old Testament saints were saved by looking forward in faith to Christ, and we are saved by looking backward to Christ. So they're looking forward in history to the moment the Messiah comes. And the Bible talks about that in terms of gospel, in terms of following Christ, believing in Christ. And we are called to look back to the same Christ, to those same events. So I think the Bible is very clear that there is one people of God, the believers in Christ. And because of Christ's advent in the middle of history, we view him from different orientations, but we're all looking to the same Christ, the same God, same salvation.
Okay, great. Well, you mentioned earlier preterism, and I want to get into this a little bit because like our church released a podcast on our church podcast, and we advocate for kind of a partial preterist perspective. This isn't in our statement of faith or anything like that. It's just like how we're trying to help people understand the events in the New Testament, 70
Right.
AD, the destruction. I guess my question is, if you're a partial preterist, is that inherently a post-mill position? Because I haven't gone that far yet. I'm happy to swim in the post-mill waters and have a lot of fun, and but I'm kind of ambivalent. I'm an amill still, and I feel like if I don't like the idea of just jumping to different theological positions in response to what's cool or what's in or what's not cool. And so, do you feel like the preterist position or even a partial preterist, does that make one a post-mill?
No. Basically, amillennialism is fully consistent with partial preterism. So basically, I could co-write a book with an amill author on partial preterism. We'd have to limit ourselves to that, but there's no inconsistency at all. But I will say that the post-mill part is the fun part.
That's right.
You're missing out, man. You're missing out, man.
Well, yeah, and help me with that, just as someone who's written a lot and studied a lot, because like a lot of this stuff, and I've talked about it on other episodes with other guests, a lot of these categories we use today, whether it's cessationism or continuationist or eschatological categories, or the way the 20th century, our approach is very systematic in our theology. And so help me understand maybe the differences like between somebody who's an all-mill and post-mill. I mean, obviously with post-mill, you've got a lot more fun. You've got a lot more, I guess, optimism. But do you find these categories to be still very durable throughout church history? Because when I look at like church history, I don't see a lot of guys going like, Calvin, I am a post-mill or I am an all-mill. They're not using these categories to describe themselves.
Yeah,
so are there other ones you might use?
The positions as we name them basically the genesis of our names begins in the Reformation era. So if you go back and look at someone like Athanasius and say, what was he eschatologically? It can be pretty hard to pin down or define. Justin Martyr was premill. We know that. They called them Chiliists back then. And I would suggest this, and I'm taking this from the late Gary North, who said there's basically only two eschatological positions. There's postmillennialism and there's amillennialism. Okay, and of course, all Christians, every eschatological position is optimistic if we go outside history. If we're after the last day, after the resurrection of the dead, everybody's optimistic. Everybody who believes in heaven is an optimist, right? But so North was talking about the course of human history. How is church history prior to the second coming going to go? And he said there's postmillennialism and amillennialism. And this is really helpful because postmillennialists, by definition, have to be amillennialists. But amillennialists and premillennialists have a choice. So it's possible for there are many people who identify themselves as optimistic amil, and I'm great with that. I don't think we ought to be in big debates about the train schedules approach to eschatology. When does this happen? That happen? So if someone, in fact, one time I read a book, Israel in the New Covenant by Roderick Campbell, that was a big help to me in coming to my post-mill convictions. And I found out years later that Campbell was amil, right? I read the book, and I didn't know that he was amil because I read the whole thing as an encouragement to post-mill. So optimistic amil is an optimillennialist. Now there's some amils who think everything's going from bad to worse and the world stinks and someday the Lord's going to come and stop the world from stinking. And they do that and they say, I'm amil, and they're pessimillennialists. So there are pessimillennialists who are amil and optimillennialists who are amil. And that's even the case with premillennialists. So dispensationalists, by definition, are pessimillennialists because the whole system depends upon the Antichrist taking over and everything going to hell in a handbasket. But you could be a premill like Charles Spurgeon was and be an optimillennialist. Charles Spurgeon believed that the Great Commission was going to be fulfilled, that the nations were going to come to Christ. So there's nothing inconsistent about premillennialism in itself and an optimistic view of evangelism and church planting and discipleship of the nations. Charles Spurgeon was very much in that category. So he was not a dispensationalist at all, but he was premill. And so consequently, I would just say optimillennial, pessimillennial, that's a better way of discussing it, I think.
Okay, great. Then one of the questions then becomes, so what do we make of the Jewish religion today? Because you helpfully point out in the book, you've got the Talmud and its whole corpus of literature, which I think most Christians aren't familiar with unless they grew up Jewish and are now Christian. How does the Talmud help us understand modern Judaism as it is expressed today?
I would go so far as to say most Jews aren't familiar with the Talmud. The rabbis, of course, study it and incorporate it and whatnot. But this is a very interesting. The Talmud was there's two Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem Talmud and there's the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud is the one that's usually referred to, and it is a collection of rabbinic teachings that begins a couple centuries before Christ. Okay. So, and it extends for maybe 3 centuries or so after Christ. So the Talmud takes shape over the course of centuries, and the Christian faith is birthed right in the middle of the history of the development of the Talmud. Okay. And Jesus famously collided with the advocates of the forming Talmud in his exchanges with them. And he said that your rabbinic teachings are simply evasiveness. You're trying to get away from the Word of God as it's found in the Old Testament. Now, what I do in the book, I've got several chapters. The Talmud is, like I said, is something that's formed over centuries with Rabbi so-and-so and then Rabbi so-and-so and Rabbi so-and-so. And sometimes the first rabbi is a Fruit Loop. He's a weirdo. And then two rabbis down, you've got someone who's very judicious and sane and careful and insightful. So it's, try to imagine someone building a religion around 5 centuries of Cosmopolitan magazine. And so Cosmopolitan in the late 1800s was a magazine back, it's late 1800s. You could find all kinds of tips on good housekeeping and sober, judicious writing. And then articles from our day, 80,000 ways to drive your man wild in bed. It's the same magazine. And so somebody has made a big mistake putting it all in one set of bound volumes and saying we're committed to this whole thing. So there are things in the Talmud that are absolutely atrocious. They're just atrocious. And anti-Semites can go in there and find them and trumpet them and say this represents the whole, which it doesn't. There are also things in the Talmud which are exegetically magnificent. They're really good. There's some really good stuff there. And so I think we should avoid a one-size-fits-all. The Philo-Semite is going to want to say there's nothing in there but sweetness and light, and the anti-Semite is going to want to say there's nothing in there but rancid and awful teachings. And I think we should say, look, it's a mixed bag. It's the Jews are sinners like the rest of us, and it's a mixed bag. And someone could take 5 centuries of Christian teaching, depending on which era you collect the papal bulls and whatnot, and find out that, okay, we've got our weirdos also. We've got.
So this, I want to start pulling this thread, and it's going to lead us into a lot of questions that I want to discuss regarding anti-Semitism, which you referenced earlier. One of the threads I want to pull first, just thinking about the Talmud, like I was a missionary to Muslims before I became a pastor, and so read the Quran, all that kind of stuff. In your understanding, should we approach other religious texts like the Quran or the Book of Mormon the same as the Talmud, or are these different?
Well, I think that part of yes and no. Some of the teaching in the Talmud is laid down before Christ and was laid down by teachers of the law who sat in Moses' seat. And Jesus expressly says they sit in Moses' seat, do what they say, but don't do what they do. So from our Lord's mouth himself, he says there's some good stuff in there. And I don't think we're doing anything wrong by finding the good stuff and saying, yeah, this is good. There was a difference between the teaching of Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai on divorce, and Jesus aligns more closely with one than the other. There's things like that. The Quran, when I've read the Quran a few times. I've the Bhagavad Gita, the Book of Mormon. You read these other sacred texts, and the Christian position is not that these other sacred texts are absolutely wrong about everything from beginning to end. Okay, but I would say that all of them are farther away from the truth of God than portions of the Talmud are. Okay, so they're all a mixed bag.
Yeah.
So when I read the Rig Veda, the Hindu scriptures, the ancient parts of the Rig Veda are quite noble, and there's some exalted passages there. And then later on, it becomes almost Canaanitic, like wicked kind of stuff.
Right.
And so you have to approach these things with just a judicious temperament. Be prepared to say, if it's good, it's good. If it's not, it's not. But the Muslims were never part of God's people. The Hindus were never part of God's people, and the Jews were.
Yeah.
And so there were faithful covenant members who contributed to the Talmud. That's the That's the bottom line.
Okay, cool. So then let's get into the definition of anti-Semitism. In the book, you describe it as the notion that Jews are uniquely malevolent and destructive in their cultural, economic, political influence in the world. Um, so that's the definition you're putting forward in the book. And like you mentioned earlier, at this point, we're in a culture where if you don't want to obliterate Gaza, if you don't want to glass Gaza, you're anti-Semitic. And so I guess my first question is, with even the phrase anti-Semitic, I sense this back in 2020 with everything being racist, right?
Right.
And we're not going to find necessarily the word racism in the Bible. We're going to find ethnic partiality, that kind of thing, even though we see Paul referring to Cretans as certain characters.
Yeah.
And so I'm perplexed, I guess, or I guess I just need some clarity on, are we in danger of importing into the Bible a word that isn't there and then using the world's kind of accusation as a starting point instead of the word of God? Does that make sense? That's the tension
Yeah.
I'm feeling.
Yes. So the first, let me address the use of the word, and then go to my definition. The use of the word, we actually have 2,000 years of Christian-Jewish interaction. Okay, and one of the odd things about this whole thing is I mentioned the Hittites earlier, but the Hittites aren't here anymore. The Ammonites aren't here anymore. The Amalekites aren't here anymore, but the Jews are still here. Okay, and we have Christians have a long history of interactions with the Jews, sometimes peaceable and there's a thing worked out, sometimes persecutions of the Christians from the Jews, other times pogroms and persecutions of the Jews from the Christians. So you've got 2,000 years of a kind of a mess, and it's a long history. It's a long history. Okay, so do we have the authority to name that? Okay, there's a pattern here, and it's something that's recurred over the course of 2,000 years. And I think that I think we have a responsibility to name it, because it keeps coming back. It keeps coming up again and again. And then there are people who claim that it's coming up when it didn't. If I'm a Christian and I say Jesus rose from the dead, and you should believe that, if someone says, well, you're anti-Semitic because you hold that, I would say you're using a false definition. You're saying being a Christian at all is anti-Semitic, which is anti-Christian, right? So that is, I think, an important point to push back on.
Yeah.
But with that said, let me return to my definition. The definition of anti-Semitism is that the Jews are uniquely malevolent. So I compare the Jews to a family of, let's say you've got a father and a mother who are both high achieving alpha types, and they have 5 kids, and they are demanding, they're tiger mom type of, and whatever you do, you're going to excel. And they get all the lessons, get the finest education, do everything. And out of the 5 kids, 3 of them go into business or medicine or law and win Pulitzer Prizes and Nobel Prizes, and they're high achieving. And let's say 2 of them go into the mafia, right? And they control all the drugs and the pornography on the East Coast. Right? But all of them are high achieving. Okay, all of them are at the top of their game, whatever that game is. Right now, expand that high achieving family to the Jews. For whatever reason, I think that long cultural isolation in Christian countries, where they've been tightly knit because they've had to be, because of their emphasis on the written word and how you study the written word. There's just high expectation. The Jews are a high performance people, and that means when they're good, they're very good, and when they're bad, they're very bad. So what happens is the anti-Semite points to all the Jewish influence in the pornography industry, or points to the fact that among the Bolsheviks and with the communist revolution, all the Jewish influence in with the Bolsheviks, or Jeffrey Epstein is a Jew, or
Yeah.
George Soros is a Jew, and they say, see, and I say, yeah, I acknowledge all of that. And when Jews are bad, they're very bad.
Sure.
And not only they're very bad, but they're very competent and very bad.
Right.
Okay. But then on the other side of the ledger, you've got the Jews are less than 1% of the world's population. And if you look at all the patents, if you look at all the Nobel Prizes, if you look at the chess masters, if you look at the world-class violinists, they are disproportionately represented in all these culturally constructive things, and they are disproportionately represented in all these culturally destructive things.
Sure.
And so the Philo-Semite wants to point to just the positive contributions. The anti-Semite wants to point to just the destructive contributions, and I want to acknowledge both.
Sure.
And so my model or metric in the book that I use is the great one of the best movies I think ever was Chariots of Fire. And in Chariots of Fire, you have the story of two Olympic runners for Great Britain. One of them, Eric Liddell, who became a Christian missionary to China and was martyred there. He was an Olympic runner, and then Harold Abrahams. Yeah, Harold. I keep wanting to say Abrams, but
Sure.
Harold Abrahams, and they're both very good, but Harold is driven, and Eric says famously, "When I run, I feel his pleasure." So they're both high performance, but one is high performance under grace, the other is high performance under law. Right? That's what I think the difference is.
Okay.
And it's a great, basically a great model or great metric for what I'm trying to communicate about the difference between high performance Christians and high performance Jews. And this gets to the central hook in my book is I believe that Paul in Romans outlines a strategy for winning the Jews. And his strategy is to see Gentiles living under God's blessing and Gentiles bringing down Deuteronomic blessings, all the promises that were promised to Israel being inherited by the Gentile church, and the Gentile church starting to live under the Deuteronomic blessings of God. And Paul says that's going to provoke the Jews to envy, which is what he gets into in Romans 10 and Romans 11. That's going to provoke the Jews to envy. And I want you to live in such a way as the Jews are looking over at the Goyim saying, what are they doing with Deuteronomy? Why is that happening for them? Anti-Semitism is the photo-negative reverse of that. So what anti-Semitism is Gentile Christians envying Jews. And I think that we ought to be living in such a way as to be confidently welcoming Jews as they come, but living in such a way as we don't need to envy them, don't need to try and scratch their eyes out. We just live under the blessing of God. And Paul says that is going to be attractive to Jews. Attractive. Paul knows his people. He knows that that's a strategy that will work on his people.
Isn't it possible, I guess, taking a reading of the word envy, that if we were to take a Girardian approach, that the envy itself would produce maybe not a uniquely malevolent, but a malevolent response to kind of Protestant Christian, whether it's hegemony or achievement? That's just a thought. As you're talking about that, I'm like, well, when you're envious, when somebody can be envious in such a way that it inspires them to change their life, I suppose. But what Girard obviously points out is that it also leads to scapegoating.
Yep.
And so would that be in the deck of cards as well?
Yes, that is. And I describe there were times in history, like in the 6th century, where there were some significant atrocities committed against Christians by Jews. And so it was not just the Jewish persecution of Christians in the 1st century, although that happened. It also happened later on. And then in the medieval Europe, there were the pogroms where the Christians were persecuting the Jews, and the Pope and various bishops were trying to protect the Jews. Some of them even providing refuge for the Jews in their homes to protect them from rioting mobs. So it really is a mixed bag. But you're exactly right. If the Christian church appropriated the entire Bible and started living under the blessings of what I call Deuteronomic blessings, there will be from some Jews a Gerardian, catty kind of malicious kickback. Some will be attracted to it. Some will be repelled by it. Some will see it as a hostile takeover. Yes, you're going to have a mixed bag in every direction.
Okay, so I want to push the analogy, and I'm trying to do my best to kind of represent what I'm seeing from some circles without, entertaining specious things. But
Right.
we've already addressed that, we have a lot of, whether ethnically or religiously Jewish people that run certain industries, or high performance people, or, this is even something Oz Guinness has highlighted on the podcast before. But we also see them high up in government positions. And so I want to use a different analogy maybe to by way of reason. And so, like, if we had in the American system, if we had cabinet positions that were filled by people with last name Chin, Wong, Wang, Zhao, and our government was like always pro-China, infallibly so, and we kept sending our military to beat up all of China's rivals in Asia, and then we burned bridges with our other allies to have unconditional support for China, and then these cabinet officials were actively subverting Christian public morality, people would probably go, that's weird. And that wouldn't make them xenophobes. They would just be, that's odd. So how would you, what would be the right way for Christians to oppose that in America if it was kind of this Chinese relationship that we had with them?
Yeah. So I would always want to distinguish anti-Semitism from disagreement with the actions of the government of Israel. Okay, that they are not the same thing. So right now in Israel, the liberals in Israel hate Netanyahu with the heat of 1,000 suns, and they hate Netanyahu far more than the most vicious anti-Semite over here does. So, but it'd be odd to call the liberals over there anti-Semitic because they want to destroy Netanyahu. Okay, so if I support or don't support a particular action of the government of Israel, that by itself does not say anything about anti-Semitism. Okay, so Netanyahu wants to take out Hamas in Gaza. I think he ought to. I support that. I think that's a totally legitimate thing to do. I think he ought to. But there are a bunch of Jews in Israel who don't think he ought to. So that's a political disagreement, right?
Yeah.
That's a political disagreement. But if someone who's not a Jew says that I don't think he ought to do it, and then they attach to it a nefarious desire on the part of all Jews to commit genocide, right? The Jews have a lust for genocide. That's a different issue. That's where the anti-Semitism comes in.
Okay, so with all that said, I think there's some particularities because you mentioned the political disagreements and that kind of thing. And there's a Twitter account named Martyrmade. His name is Daryl. He hosts a podcast with Jocko Willink, and so this one a lot of guys listen to. And he lists out like 5, like if we were to put it in like Christian terms or government terms, we affirm this, we deny this. So he says, first, Jews need Christ like everyone else, and Christians shouldn't discourage them with wild displays of vulgar anti-Semitism. And no, saying Jews need Christ is not anti-Semitism, it's just Christianity. The second is criticizing.
Amen. So
okay,
just
one at a time. Yeah.
Amen to that.
All right. Criticizing and condemning Israel, even in extreme terms, given its barbaric behavior, is not anti-Semitism. Now, just to be clear, he's done a lot of podcast episodes on like the history of Israel and Gaza, different atrocities committed. And so To say it again, criticizing and condemning Israel as a nation state, even in extreme terms, given its barbaric behavior, is not anti-Semitism. I think you would agree with that, even if you may disagree that the political behavior they've exhibited is barbaric. Is that something you would agree with or no?
Yes. So I agree in principle. So if the Jews are guilty of an atrocity,
Right.
then there's no Christian should want to defend the indefensible.
Right.
Right. But in one of the things that we have to remember here, and this would be a big qualification, is the one you noted, and that would be how reliable is that factual analysis.
Right.
One of the first casualties in any warfare is the truth. Okay, because atrocity stories are an essential weapon in the arsenal of every fight. Okay, so if the Jews are guilty of committing genocide in Gaza right now, and they're destroying everybody's life, and well, that sounds like a good argument for Hamas to surrender.
Sure.
Right, but to go in there and say they've done this, and this, and this, I would say, okay, this is an extraordinarily complicated geopolitical snarl that goes back goes back centuries, but in this particular territory, it goes back to the formation of Israel by the West as the result of Lord Balfour's declaration, and Israel being formed as a nation state in 1948. And this is the difference between your earlier illustration about China and Israel. This is the Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you buy it.
Sure.
All right. We're the ones, the West, we're the ones who planted Israel on Zionist principles in that neck of the woods. And so we put them there.
Right.
And we have been paying for it ever since. But the fact that let's say this is another thing I should mention. I don't have any Zionist theology. So I'm not a Zionist in the sense that I think that the Jews ought to have gone back to the land in 1948 in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. I'm not a Zionist. I don't believe in manifest destiny either, but I live in Idaho.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would take it ill if the Nez Perce tribe or the Coeur d'Alene tribe started shooting rockets into my town every day. I'd say, look, I don't agree with what they did a century ago, but they did it, and there are millions of people here now.
Sure.
Okay, let's work out a peaceable solution now. Right.
Right.
And I think so. Here's the essential thing. I have no problem given the complexities and the longstanding animosities. I have no problem if someone says, "Look, you have to agree that the Jews have probably done some dirty deeds over the years in this conflict." I'd say, okay, for the sake of argument, I'm willing to spot that. Okay, I'm willing to say, okay. But one of the things that is different about the Jews and Hamas, about Israel and Hamas, is that if Israel does these things, they have to deny all responsibility. They have to do it surreptitiously, under the cover of darkness, and nobody can know about it. Okay? Hamas does what they do with the cameras running in the open light of day, and they claim responsibility.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So if someone blows up a pizza parlor in Tel Aviv, and they claim responsibility, yes, we killed all those teenagers and we did it on purpose.
Right.
Okay, that's what Hamas does. Now, let's say Israel retaliated in the middle of the night and took out the person who plotted that terrorist attack and his whole family.
Right.
Okay. They would deny having done that.
Sure.
They would disclaim responsibility. Mm-hmm. And if it was proven that someone was responsible, an Israeli captain or whatever, they would try him.
Yeah.
Right. They would say, oh, because, and this is even if it's a cynical hypocrisy. And so the thing that baffles me about all of this is when people look at the Israeli-Muslim conflict there, and the Muslims are doing what they're doing openly, nakedly, unashamed. This is what we do. We want from the river to the sea. We want to kill them all. Right.
Yeah.
I say, okay, that's. I want to do you the courtesy of believing what you say.
Right. Okay. The third point, and I think this is going to be the one that maybe gets into other issues we already talked about, but he says criticizing diaspora Jews, Jewish leaders, and organizations who support Israel's what he claims to be barbarism out of ethno-religious loyalty is not anti-Semitism. An example, maybe. So I was listening to Ben Shapiro off and on, and then I wanted to hear his perspective on, as a Jewish man, Daily Wire, I wanted to hear his perspective on what was going on over there. And then after a few episodes out of that, I was like, good Lord, like this is just so like one-sided, and that's fine. But there's a great deal of kind of ethno-religious loyalty, and I don't blame him for that necessarily. But is criticizing diaspora Jews, Jewish leaders, organizations who support Israel's political decisions, whether they're barbaric or not, is that anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it need not be. So in principle, it need not be. Someone might criticize the Jewish leaders in America for circling the wagons, and this is my side, and I'm going to advocate for my side. And let's say you have a different perspective. It's possible for a judicious person who's not anti-Semitic to be critical of that. Yes, that's possible. But you have to understand that ethno-religious loyalties are a main factor in ethno-religious wars. Right? That's what this is. So when we got attacked at Pearl Harbor, and one of the things we did was round up all the people of Japanese descent and put them in concentration camps in California. What was that? Well, and were there any injustices done? Well, yeah, there are always going to be injustices done because war is terrible.
Right. Yeah.
It's just terrible. And it's terrible for the civilian population of Gaza, which is why Hamas ought not to have attacked the way they did.
Right. Yeah. And I think maybe one by reasoning by way of analogy would be I can't remember her name right now, Somali congresswoman who openly spouts her loyalty to Somalia more than America. That's
Right.
disconcerting. I mean, as an American citizen, for those reasons. So I think that may be a corollary example to say this is why it's concerning when there is circling of the wagons on these ethno-religious things. Does that kind of track as well?
Yes, it does. But I would always point out, remember that both sides are circling the wagons.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Number 4 out of 5, pointing out the greatly disproportionate number of Jewish Americans in high positions of media, finance, and government, and just asking whether it influences U.S. policy and the media portrayal of Israel. Just pointing that out, that's not anti-Semitism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, just pointing it out is not anti-Semitism, but I would say this goes back to an earlier point.
Yeah,
I would say how'd they all get into those positions of influence?
Sure.
If you think, well, they're in these positions of influence because they're cheating, okay, then that's where the anti-Semitic virus comes in.
Okay.
Well, maybe they just work harder than you do.
Sure.
Maybe so. If they want their position, if they want to be influential, if they want their voice to be heard, they put in the work. They do the reading. They get there. So all of a sudden, the Jews are in Babylon, and lo, Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king. Right? They know how to do this.
Sure.
And when Christians whine about it, I think, why are you complaining about the influence they have because they've got all these cabinet positions? Why don't Protestant evangelical Christians have cabinet positions?
Sure.
Well, it's because we have a theology that runs counter to that. This world is not my home. We have a pietistic streak that retreats from cultural engagement. And so I would much prefer to have Christians competing openly with Jews, openly and honestly, with a good attitude, rather than sitting back and being armchair quarterbacks of the influence that they have
Sure.
because they put in the work.
Yeah, I think this also gets into the concept of I think it's resentment is how it's supposed to be pronounced,
Yeah.
but resentment, and it's really dangerous. It's bitter, covetousness, and so I guess maybe to dive into this one a little bit more would be the assumption is they got into these positions of power because they're hardworking, they outperformed us, they're high achieving people.
Mm-hmm.
Then the question becomes, what if that's not why they're in the position of power? Well, even then, we shouldn't give in to resentment, right? We shouldn't be bitter, but is entertaining the possibility, similar with like we've got a freaking U.S. congressman who slept with a Chinese spy, so like the Chinese narrative isn't that far fetched,
Right.
But
yeah, not only that, he sleeps with a Chinese spy, and nothing happens to him.
right. Right. And so I guess is entertaining the possibility that it's not simply high performance people type understanding, is entertaining that possibility anti-Semitism in your view?
I think it opens the door to it. I don't think it's obviously someone who doesn't have a bigoted bone in his body can wonder if some people do get to positions of authority by cheating, right? That sometimes does happen. And so it's not anti-Semitism to wonder that in a particular instance or not.
Right.
But when it's consistent across the board, and you're oh, look at Goldberg,
Sure,
oh, look at that,
sure.
Epstein, look at that, Goldstein, look at that, and it starts to become a theme, and I just see the wrong kind of attitude.
Sure.
Which I've identified as envy.
Yeah.
And envy is easier than working.
True. All right. The last one on his kind of tweet on this, and I'll put a link to this for you listeners in the show notes. Holding the Jewish family down the street responsible for the behavior of the IDF, ADL, any other Jewish organization, that would be anti-Semitism. So if you have a Jewish neighbor and you hold them responsible for Israeli foreign policy or the IDF, that would be anti-Semitism. Would that be fair to say?
I would, yes.
Okay.
Unless they've got a flag out front that says three cheers for what was just done.
Sure.
But yes, I think that's a good example where you blame individual Jews that for the behavior of that which you disagree with. And this is where I recently wrote a piece on this where this is Christian Ethics 101. The measure that you use is the measure that will be used on you. Judge not lest you be judged. For the judgment with which you judge, you shall be judged. So if someone says, hey, this guy down the street is Jewish and Netanyahu just bombed a hospital or something, and he's Jewish too. And I would say, yeah, you're white. And so is Ted Bundy.
Sure. Right. Yeah. All right. Last couple questions here before I let you go. Because you've got kind of two individuals, let's say. You got one that's asking about the Jews because he does hate Jews for whatever reason. He just has hatred, envy in his heart, bitter, deep contempt for anyone with that ethno-religious heritage particularly. Well, the way to answer that person is the way you've responded, your Britos responded, is repent, cut it out, stop that. But then you've got a second individual, a faithful person, Christian, productive, involved in his church, asking questions about the group. And they themselves, the group may seem to have a very which we've already talked about, ethno-religious identitarian kind of viewpoint. Like they're going to protect their own. What would you say to the second guy who's asking these questions in good faith? Because I think there's a lot of I sense there's actually a lot of guys in that second category. How would you respond to that guy who's asking these questions in good faith?
I'd answer them in good faith.
Okay, cool.
I think that we ought not to put discussions of these issues off limits.
Right.
Okay. If someone it really, him, he's not a bigot. He's not, he's simply following up on questions and he's asking them. I believe that if the response of the Christian leadership is shut up, we don't talk about that.
Right.
Then then what that is going to do is going to be counterproductive.
Correct.
What that is going to do is feed anti-Semitism, because someone's going to share a meme with this guy. Who are you not allowed to criticize?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I don't have any problem criticizing Jewish leaders. I don't mind any problem criticizing bad actors. And when someone does something appalling, I could go after him and say, he said this, he's done the other thing, to pick on Jeffrey Epstein.
Right.
Again. All right. But I could do all that without any reference in my head or on paper to the fact that he's Jewish.
Sure.
And me dragging that in doesn't help with the criticism.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What it does is causes suspicion to fall on me. Wait. Why are you going after him?
Right.
So if you're talking about honest discussion between honest Christians who've read something and they want to raise these questions, the most counterproductive thing in the world you can do is to say, no, that topic is off limits.
Right.
Okay. And that's why I wrote the book.
Okay.
But this is one of the things, this is quite striking, because with Candace's recent tiff with Daily Wire and departing there over Jews, and Tucker's comments the other night, and all of that, and the fact that this is a lively chatter sort of thing on Twitter. It's a thing.
Yep.
All right. This is a thing. I would have expected the book that I just wrote to have made a bigger splash than it did. Okay. But what's happened is people are saying, why are we not allowed to talk about this? Why can't we raise honest questions? And what this book does is to say, okay, let's meet these honest questions head on.
Sure.
And I'm going to give you biblical answers head on. I don't think I left any significant issue untouched in this book.
Yeah.
And the issue is not that people have written extensive reviews countering my arguments. What they've done is they've ignored the arguments.
Mm-hmm.
But they said, I want to raise good faith questions, and if you give a good faith answer, I will ignore it. That's the thing that indicates to me that there's a problem.
Sure.
So
that makes sense. Okay, cool.
Of course, I make an exception for this noble podcast. But it's quite striking to me that I talk about books that I've written and all kinds of issues, and this may be the only podcast on this issue that I've done. There may have been another one, or there's one scheduled.
Interesting,
but it's nothing like what happened with Mere Christendom. Nothing like, and it's a hot issue.
Yeah.
So
why?
That tells me that there are a number of people who want to raise the question, but they don't want an answer.
Yeah, and maybe I can see that for sure. Yeah, it's a live issue, and that also gets into why I started the podcast originally, was because I saw a lot of questions being raised during 2020 with whether it's COVID or BLM or any kind of thing, and I'm like, where are the Christian leaders? Why aren't they? Mm-hmm. They have all this power, they have all this influence, they could write articles, and they're silent. And so I appreciate you writing the book. I think more conversations need to be had on this matter to be helpful for people to think clearly and to kind of give a lay of the land. Where can we disagree in good faith, and where are we saying we violate biblical law or biblical wisdom on discussing these matters? So particularly we're not going to be able to talk about it, but the Deuteronomic blessing. Gosh, I can't say that word. That chapter is really interesting for you listeners because it offers a different perspective on wealth creation, money, influence, all this kind of stuff. And so I really want to commend that chapter because I think it really offers a good view towards how we can understand the blessings of God in our day. Doug, anything else you want to mention before we close out?
I really appreciate you taking the time to work through this.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug. Thanks for coming on the show. If you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you subscribe, share the episode with a friend. Apparently, not many people are buying the book or having this conversation. Maybe this would be a good primer to get a conversation going with somebody in your life. You can also sign up on the Patreon. That helps me bring great content to you. Go sign up in the show notes for the Patreon. $5 a month get you a sticker, and then $15 get you a mug. So go sign up on that. Until then, we'll see you next time.